Greetings, everyone. Today we will discuss Introduction to Statutory Construction. Just a disclaimer before anything else, the individual behind this YouTube channel created this video as a means of studying the subject. He is a law student, not a lawyer. He is only sharing his insights and understanding on the subject statutory construction. What is statutory construction? It is an art or process of discovering and expounding the meaning and intention of the authors of the law with respect to its application to a given case where that intention is rendered doubtful, amongst others, by reason of the fact that the given case is not explicitly provided for in the law. That's according to the case of Caltex versus Palomar. So, we have to distinguish what is construction and what is interpretation. Many of us use construction and interpretation interchangeably, but there is, in reality, a huge difference between the two. What are they? When we say construction, it is the drawing of conclusions with respect to subjects which lie beyond the direct expression of the text from, elements known from, and given in the text. When we say interpretation, it is the exploration of the written text itself. In other words, one who interprets makes use of intrinsic aids, or those found in the statute itself, while on the other hand, one who constructs makes use of extrinsic aids, or those found outside of the written language of the law. Therefore, you cannot construe unless you interpret first. What are the characteristics of statutory construction? Based on the definition from Caltex versus Palomar, it is an art or process. Statutory construction is not an exact science. It does not depend on a set of formulas that can be readily applied to every case. They are not rules of law, but mere axioms of experience. No one has yet determined a coherent theory that reconciles decisions involving statutory interpretation. It is one of the most complex and problematic mental processing that ordinary lawyers and judges are called upon to perform. Let's have the doctrines in statutory construction. First, we have doctrine of last antecedent. It says that qualifying words and phrases normally refer to the last antecedent word or phrase unless the context otherwise provides. In the case of Cañada versus Tovera, this was not applied in interpreting Article 2 of the Civil Code of the Philippines. In statutory construction, even if a particular doctrine, rule, or principle is applicable to a given case, if its application will run counter the clear legislative intent, then it will not be applied. So what does Article 2 of the Civil Code provide? It says that laws shall take effect after 15 days following the completion of their publication, either in the official gazette or in a newspaper of general circulation in the Philippines, unless, here's the catchy phrase, unless it is otherwise provided. So, if you will notice the highlighted phrases, the first one says after 15 days. The second one says completion of their publication. One of the issues in this case, in the case of Cañada versus Tovera, is what did the provision pertain when it says unless it is otherwise provided? Does it pertain to the period of publication or the requirement of publication? In applying the doctrine of last antecedent, obviously, it is the requirement of publication. However, if we interpret Article 2 of the Civil Code that way, then it implies that publication is only optional. In other words, it is not required. However, the Supreme Court ruled here that the clear object of the above quoted provision is to give the general public adequate notice of the various laws which are to regulate their actions and conduct as citizens. Without such notice and publication, there would be no basis for the application of the maxim ignorantia legis non excusat, or in English, ignorance of the law excuses no one. It would be the height of injustice to punish or otherwise burden a citizen for the transgression of a law which he had no notice whatsoever, not even a constructive one. So in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that publication is actually part of the due process of law. So it cannot be interpreted to make it optional. So we have already established that statutory construction, in the case of Caltex versus Palomar, that it is not an exact science. No one has yet determined a coherent theory that reconciles decisions involving statutory interpretation. So despite not having a coherent theory, there is a primary objective in statutory construction. That is to ascertain and give effect to the intent of the legislature. So if that primary objective will be defeated by using the tools of construction, then the court will be constrained to undermine it, or in other words, it cannot be applied. Another doctrine, ejus dem generis, where the general words follow an enumeration of persons or things by words of a particular and specific meaning. Such general words are not to be construed in their widest extent, but are held to be applying only to those persons or things of the same kind or class as those specifically mentioned. This doctrine was not followed in the case of Philippine American Drug Co. versus Internal Revenue, Commissioner of Internal Revenue. This case involves the interpretation of Section 183, Paragraph B of the Tax Code. In other words, the doctrine of ejus dem generis, when we encounter a general word in a statute, in ejus dem generis, its meaning should be restricted only to those named in the preceding words. So if we will read this case, the question raised before the Supreme Court is whether or not the premium on the dollar charged by the bank of the petitioner importer for the purchase of foreign exchange should be included in the computation of the advance sales tax for landed cost of the goods imported by the petitioner. So the gist in this case is that the petitioner contended that the bank charge for the purchase of foreign exchange should not fall under the category of similar charges, because if we read the tax code, this is in compliance with the doctrine of ejus dem generis. Its reason is that bank charge is not similar to charges specifically mentioned in the provision. If we read Article Section 183, Paragraph B of Tax Code, it enumerated freight, postage, insurance, commission, customs duty, and all similar charges. We said in ejus dem generis that general expression should be restricted only to those named in the preceding words. So sabi ni petitioner, hindi naman magkapareho ang bank charge sa charges specifically mentioned in this provision. But what was the statement of the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court held that the petitioner is wrong. Why? Because it will defeat the purpose of the law, that is to include all charges or items of expense in determining the sales tax. So from these instances, we can concede that even if the words in the statute are organized in a manner contemplated by a certain rule of construction, it does not automatically mean that such rule should be applied. So that's one of the reasons why statutory construction is not an exact science, but an art or process. So theories of construction should not be permitted to defeat the plainly indicated purpose of the legislature. The question before a judge in interpreting a statute is whether or not the written text correctly expresses the legislative intent. There is no consistent theory, but there is a consistent objective. What is it? Which is to ascertain and give effect to the intent of the legislature. Now, we are still under the characteristics of statutory construction, and the second one is it involves the determination of the legislative intent. The primary objective of construction is to ascertain and give effect to the intention of the legislature. Legislative intent is the end sought to be achieved by the legislature in an enactment. The duty of the courts is to carry out the intention of the legislature unless such intent is in conflict with constitutional provisions. So, as I said earlier, while it is true that there is no consistent theory in statutory construction, there is a consistent objective. Needless to say, in cases of conflict between a statute and the Constitution, it is the Constitution that should prevail. Judicial interpretation constitutes part of the law as of the date the law was passed, since construction merely establishes the legislative intent. So when the court construe a law, they are merely affirming what was the originally intended or the original intention of the legislature in enacting that statute. The rules on construction should be tested according to its results. That is, the intention of the law in question must be sought for its nature, the object to be accomplished, and the purpose to be subserved, and its relation to the Constitution. So that's according to the case of Araneta versus Dinglasan. This is actually another interesting case. The question here is whether or not the executive orders issued by the President pursuant to Commonwealth Act 671 or the Emergency Powers Act have ceased to have any effect, notwithstanding the fact that it did not have an expiration date. So this was actually during the war between the US and other countries in Europe and Asia. The Philippines got involved. That's why the National Assembly enacted the Commonwealth Act 671. Under Section 2 of this Commonwealth Act, it enumerated the powers granted to the President. So in order to execute such powers, the President had to issue executive orders. Now, the question here is, since the Commonwealth Act 671 has no expiration date, what will happen to the executive orders issued by the President during this time? Are they going to be permanent because the Congress did not put an expiration date? Or is a separate repealing law necessary for it to cease? The Supreme Court held in this case since Article 6 of the Constitution already provides that the law that may be passed by Congress authorizing the President to carry out a declared national policy in times of war or national emergency shall be for a limited period. There is no need for a separate repealing law, since by its nature, a law intended to address emergencies such as Commonwealth Act 671 must be temporary in nature, and that it was approved with this limitation in view. Since Article 6 of the Constitution already provide that, then it is already understood that it is only for a limited period. Legislative intent must be ascertained from a consideration of the statute as a whole and not of an isolated part or a particular provision alone. It's emphasized in this part that the primary objective of statutory construction is to ascertain the legislative intent. And in doing so, the judge is not allowed to disregard other provisions of the law to interpret such law according to what he or she desires. The judge should interpret the law or statute as a whole. In the case of General versus Barameda, the Supreme Court held that a correct solution in interpreting auction sales must entail not only the determination of the meaning of the words, but more importantly, a determination of the legislative intent, since it depends more on a determination of the purpose and objective of the law. Here we can see how the Supreme Court implied the difference between interpretation and construction, as we have mentioned earlier. We mentioned earlier that in interpretation, you will only use intrinsic aids or the text found in the statute itself. In construction, you will use extrinsic aids, meaning you go beyond the text itself and ascertain and give effect to the intent of the legislature. Here, the Supreme Court, in doing so, actually cited previous rulings, if you will read this case. They cited previous rulings to decide the case before them. But later we will also learn that it is a cardinal rule in statutory construction that when the law is clear, there's no need for interpretation or construction. The only thing that you need to do is to apply it. In Molina versus Rafferty, the question raised before the Supreme Court is whether or not fish is an agricultural product under Section 40 of the Administrative Code. The Supreme Court observed that when the first Internal Revenue Law was enacted by the Commission, it was clear that the commissioners must have in mind agriculture as known to them in the US. Where a distinction was created between agriculture and fishery, it then concluded that the purpose of the legislature in exempting agricultural products from taxation under the Internal Revenue Law was to encourage farming and not fishing. How did the Supreme Court decide? In this case kasi, under the then Administrative Code, agriculture products, when sold, should be excluded from taxation. So the petitioner is the owner of various fish ponds in Bulacan. Sabi ni petitioner, agriculturist daw siya. Kaya dapat exempted siya from taxation. So the Supreme Court took note of the definition of the word agriculture, and it is an art or science of cultivating the ground, including the preparation of the soil, the planting of seeds, the raising and harvesting of crops, and the rearing, feeding, and management of livestock. Not only this, the Supreme Court also said that we can best discover the legislative intent through the medium of action taken by it in the enactment of other laws. So, the petitioner was wrong. That's according to the Supreme Court. So we are still under the characteristics. It is necessary when the legislative intent cannot be readily ascertained from the words used in the law as applied under a set of facts. A cardinal rule on statutory construction is that when the law is clear and free from doubt or ambiguity, there is no room for construction or interpretation. There is only room for application. As the statute is clear, plain, and free from ambiguity, it must be given its literal meaning and applied without attempted interpretation. This is what is known as the plain meaning rule of or verba legis. It is expressed in the maxim index animis sermo, or speech is an index of intention. Furthermore, there is the maxim verba legis non recidendum, or in other words, from the words of the statute, there should be no departure. So we mentioned earlier that before we can construe, we must interpret the law first. We also mentioned that when the law is clear, you just simply have to apply it, and there's no need for interpretation or construction. What can we learn from this? Meaning, the primary task of the court is to apply the law. This is one of the cardinal rules in statutory construction. When there is ambiguity in the language of a statute, courts employ canons of statutory construction to ascertain its true intent and meaning. Canons of construction do not, however, solve the special difficulties in construing a particular statute. The variables render every problem of statutory construction unique. For this reason, the court may utilize in construing a statute not unambiguous all the light relevantly shed upon the words and the clause of the statute that express the purpose of the legislature. The first and fundamental duty of the court is to apply the law. Construction and interpretation come only after it has been demonstrated that the application is impossible or inadequate without them. So in other words, only when there is ambiguity that the courts employ canons of construction to ascertain the true legislative intent. But as he said earlier, construction is an art or process, and it is not an exact science. So even if these canons of constructions exist, and even if the words of a statute are organized in a manner contemplated by a rule on construction, still, when the courts encounter ambiguities, they consider it as unique. Because there's no fixed theory in statutory construction. Every problem of statutory construction is unique. That's why the courts have to apply the law first. Kapag hindi talaga pwede, that's the time that they can interpret or construe. So how to determine whether the statute is ambiguous? When the statute is capable of two or more reasonable interpretations, such as that man of common intelligence must necessarily guess at its meaning and differ as to its interpretation. So this is known as test of multiple interpretations. Second, when the literal application is impossible or inadequate, this is called as test of impossibility. Third, when all literal interpretation of the statute leads to an unjust, absurd, unreasonable, or mischievous result, or one at variance with the policy of the legislation as a whole. This is also known as test of absurdity or unreasonableness. So the burden is on the party arguing for the need to go beyond the literal meaning of the words used in the statute and construe the same in order to determine its applicability under a given set of circumstances. Like what happened in the case of Caltex versus Palomar, the postmaster said that the law is clear and it should not be applied to the given case. So the Supreme Court said the postmaster was wrong. The issue calls for the construction of the law in question. In other words, the Supreme Court in that case was convinced by the petitioner's argument that why is it necessary to determine whether promotional scheme falls within the prohibitory provisions of Section 1954 of the Revised Administrative Code. This is in view of the uncertainty of its applicability under the circumstances thereof. So, it is a judicial function. We are still under the characteristics of statutory construction. It is a judicial function. The duty and power to interpret or construe the law or statute or the Constitution belong to the judiciary. It is the duty of the legislature to make the law. It is basic under constitutional law. The legislature will make the law, the executive will execute the law, and the judiciary will construe or interpret the law. The legislature has no authority to execute or construe the law. The executive has no authority or it has no power to make or construe the law, and the judiciary as well has no power to make or execute the law. So since it is the judiciary who has the final say in every question of constitutionality, does it mean that it is more powerful than the other departments? The judiciary does not assert superiority over other departments. It does not in reality nullify or invalidate an act of the legislature, but only asserts its solemn and sacred obligation assigned to it by the Constitution. That's from the landmark case of Angara versus Electoral Commission. Because again, it is not just a power, but it is also a duty of the court to construe or interpret the law. This is explicitly enshrined in the Constitution under Article 8, Section 1. So what does Article 8, Section 1 say? The judicial power shall be vested in the Supreme Court, in one Supreme Court, and in such other lower courts as may be established by law. Judicial power includes the duty of the courts of justice to settle actual controversies involving rights which are legally demandable and enforceable, and to determine whether or not there's been a grave abuse of discretion amounting to lack or excess of jurisdiction on the part of any branch or instrumentality of the government. So, other than this, the Supreme Court also has symbolic function in recent jurisprudence, that is to formulate controlling principles to guide the bench, the bar, and the public. Before the Supreme Court can exercise its judicial power, there are essential requisites that must concur. So, the question, can you pass a law abolishing the Supreme Court? The answer is no. Why? Because it is a constitutional court. It is explicitly stated under the fundamental law, which is the Constitution. It says here, judicial power shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such other lower courts as may be established by law. So if a statute is enacted abolishing the Supreme Court, then that statute should be declared unconstitutional. You cannot abolish the Supreme Court unless you revise the Constitution. So We mentioned earlier that there are requisites for judicial review. This is also from the landmark case of Francisco versus House of Representatives. So what are they? There should be an actual case or controversy calling for the exercise of judicial power. The person challenging the act must have a standing to challenge. The question of constitutionality must be raised at the earliest possible opportunity. The issue of constitutionality must be the very least mota of the case. So for example, when a former President Rodrigo Duterte expressed his intention to run for the 2022 Vice President, before the election period and before Duterte filed his COC, you question, for example, the pronouncement of Duterte before the Supreme Court. Is that allowed? No, because there is no actual case yet. Dapat magkaroon muna ng alleged violation before the Supreme Court can intervene. The Supreme Court cannot give an advisory opinion. This is also known as locus standi, because the person must have personal and substantial interest in the case, such that he or she has sustained or will sustain a direct injury as a result of the alleged governmental act that is being challenged. Because it says on the third requisite, the question of constitutionality must be raised at the earliest of possible opportunity. In other words, pag meron ka ng opportunity to raise the unconstitutionality of that issue, and it is apparent that you immediately, on that occasion, you can raise it, then you have to raise it immediately. Otherwise, it would be deemed that you have waived your opportunity to raise it. So the fourth requisite, the issue of constitutionality must be the very least mota of the case. What is this? The courts will not touch the issue of constitutionality unless it is truly unavoidable. Or in other words, it is the very least mota or the crux of the controversy. So we are done with the characteristics of statutory construction. Now let's move on to the purpose. The cardinal rule in the interpretation of the laws is to ascertain and give effect to the intent of the law. All rules of construction or interpretation have for their sole object the ascertainment of the true intent of the legislature. We mentioned several times that the primary objective of statutory construction is to ascertain and give effect to the intent of the legislature. Even if there is no fixed theory in determining it, there is a fixed objective. A statute must be read in such a way as to give effect to the purpose of the projected statute. The objective of all judicial interpretation of a statute is to determine legislative intent. What intention is conveyed, either expressly or impliedly, by the language used, so far as it is necessary for ascertaining whether the particular case or state of facts presented to the court comes within it. The true object of all rules of statutory construction is to ascertain legislative intent. We mentioned this many times already. The spirit or intention of the statute prevails over the letter thereof. So there are varying theories in statutory interpretation. Some of them are textualist. The words used takes as precedence over any other words in the construction. It employs a reader-centered or heuristic approach. It focuses on the statutory text as perceived by the reader. Its strength is simplicity, and its weakness is that words often do not mean the same to everyone. Second, intentionalism. It emphasizes meaning intended by the author of the law. It does not require the establishment of ambiguity before it can resort to extrinsic sources of construction. Its strength is the consistency with the objective of construction since it inquires into the original intent. Its weakness is that the legislature consists of many people from different backgrounds and with different motivations. Its simplistic application will fail to reconcile the general intent of the legislature. Lastly, we have purposivism. It focuses on determining the problem that the legislature is seeking to address. So, despite these theories, we have to remember again that in statutory construction, as we earlier pointed out, there is no fixed theory. As we read in the decisions of the Supreme Court from several cases, they do not adopt a single unitary theory of construction. We can perhaps say that while the courts are moderate textualists in theory because of the plain meaning rule, they are, on the other hand, intentionalists as well, and they can also be purposivist in approach. This is evidenced by the fact that while the court prioritizes the plain meaning rule as the objective manifestation of legislative intent, the court has not hesitated to state that if the language of the statute is inconsistent with its spirit, then the spirit should prevail. So, there are related legal principles. We have separation of powers. We have mentioned this case a while ago, the landmark case of Angara versus Electoral Commission. It obtains not through express provision, but only by actual division in our Constitution. Nowhere you can find in the Constitution that says separation of powers or system of checks and balances. But despite that, since each branch of the government is actually divided by the Constitution, then they are deemed to have been separated. Thus, it adheres to the system of checks and balances. Second, the Constitution did not intend them to be absolutely unrestrained and independent of each other. Rather, the Constitution provided for an elaborate system of checks and balances to secure coordination in the workings of the various departments of the government. It is called the system of checks and balances. This is the concept. The legislative department will make, alter, and repeal law. The executive will execute the laws, and the judiciary will interpret the laws. We already mentioned this earlier. So each department is supreme within its own sphere. If one of them is dysfunctional, all of them will be affected. That's the very concept of separation of powers and the system of checks and balances. In case of conflict, the judicial department is the only organ which can be called upon to determine the proper allocation of powers. So as earlier mentioned, the exercise of power to judicial review is not just a power, but it is a duty assigned to the courts by the Constitution. Fourth, when the judiciary allocates constitutional boundaries, it does not assert any superiority over other departments. It does not in reality nullify or invalidate an act of the legislature, but only asserts the solemn obligation and sacred obligation assigned to it by the Constitution. So we earlier mentioned that there is a separation of powers. What is the purpose? To prevent one branch of the government to encroach upon the domain of another. That's the primary purpose. So it is not for the purpose of absolute superiority of the judicial department. So lastly, there is a presumption of constitutionality. It is accorded to the legislative departments not only because the legislative is presumed to abide by the Constitution, but also because the judiciary must reflect the wisdom and justice of the people as expressed through their representatives in the executive and legislative departments. For example, Congress enacted a bill. Then it was signed by the president. Thus, it became a law. And for example, it became effective following the requirement of publication under Article 2 of the Civil Code. At that instance, can the court declare such law unconstitutional? The answer is no. Because first, there are essential requisites for the Supreme Court to exercise its power of judicial review. Second, there is a presumption of constitutionality. Why is that? Aside from the fact that the legislative department is presumed to abide by the Constitution, the judiciary is also reflecting the wisdom and justice of the people as expressed through their representatives in the executive and legislative department. Because under Article 2 of the Constitution, sovereignty resides in the people and all government authority emanates from them. So hierarchy of laws. A constitution is a system of fundamental laws for the governance and administration of a nation. It is supreme, imperious, absolute, and unalterable, except by the authority from which it emanates. If a law or contract violates any form or any norm of the Constitution, that law or contract, whether promulgated by the legislative or by the executive branch, entered into by private persons for private purposes, is null and void without any force and effect. This is from the landmark case of Manila Prince Hotel versus GSIS. So we earlier mentioned that when the courts construe a law, they do not look into the text or intention of the legislature per se. They also determine the soundness based on the supreme law of the land, which is the Constitution. So we have also stare decisis. Article 8 of the Civil Code provides judicial decisions applying or interpreting the laws of the Constitution shall form part of the legal system of the Philippines. So this is manifested under Article 8. The doctrine of stare decisis refers to the principle of adherence to precedents for reasons of stability in the law. The doctrine requires lower courts to follow the rules established in prevailing decisions of the Supreme Court. Just like the Constitution, it is the supreme law of the land. All other laws or contracts should not contravene it. The Constitution authorizing the Supreme Court, since it is supreme, that's why it is called Supreme Court, because it is supreme. Its decisions form part of the legal system, and the lower courts should not contravene it in making their decisions. When a principle of law is laid down as applicable to a certain set of facts, it will adhere to that principle and apply it to all future cases in which the facts are substantially the same. So that's the requirement. It should be substantially the same. So when can we apply stare decisis? The yardstick is that the facts should be substantially the same. It is not a requirement to have exactly the same facts. Okay? Like the same parties, the same issues, the same prayers. It is enough that it is substantial. If we are to have it, the same parties, same issues, or same prayers, it will fall under res judicata, not stare decisis. So here is the res judicata. Questions or issues conclusively settled by a judgment becomes res judicata and may not again be litigated in the subsequent action between the same parties or their previous. In such cases, it is immaterial that two actions are based on different grounds, or tried in different theories, or instituted for different purpose and seek different reliefs. So that's res judicata. The elements of res judicata are as follows. The judgment sought to bar the new action must be final. The decision must have been rendered by a court having jurisdiction over the subject matter and the parties, and the disposition of the case must be a judgment based on the merits. Also, there must be, as between the first and second action, identity of parties, subject matter, and causes of action. Two concepts of res judicata, what are they? Bar by prior judgment and conclusiveness of judgment. So what are the difference between stare decisis and res judicata? This might be asked in your exams. The doctrine of stare decisis is based on legal principle or rule involved and not upon the judgment which results therefrom. And in this particular sense, stare decisis differs from res judicata, which is based upon the judgment. The doctrine of stare decisis is one of policy grounded on the necessity for securing certainty and stability of judicial decisions. So that's the difference. When we say stare decisis, it is based upon the legal principle or the rule involved in that case. On the other hand, when we say res judicata, it is based upon the judgment. So that would be all. Thank you for listening. May your love for the law remain strong as always. Thank you so much.